advocacy work. What's the background of this, and how can folks get engaged, like some of you have already started talking about? So my name is Heather Hiscox, and I'm the CEO and founder of Pause for Change. And at Pause for Change, we work with nonprofit, local government, and philanthropic foundations to really help them solve problems more efficiently and effectively. And Jennifer, if you could introduce yourself briefly, and I'll put Jennifer's bio in the chat, and give us a sense of your background as well.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I am glad that you're here. I'm really excited about this conversation today. My name is Jennifer Njuguna. I am an attorney, and I'm not currently affiliated with an organization, but I've spent over a decade in the nonprofit space in a number of different roles. And so this topic is just something that I'm really passionate about, and just can't wait to get started on our conversation.
Awesome. So the first question that really kicked off our first chat is, what is your take on policy and advocacy work in the sector? And can you share how you define policy and advocacy? Because I thought it was really an interesting differentiation that you make. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I'll get started with the definition, and then I'll talk about what it means for the sector. So I see policy as a very specific kind of advocacy. And generally, I think advocacy is just the tools and the way that we approach systems change. Regardless of what change we're trying to see, it's our means for moving past the status quo of what currently exists. Policy is really about the kind of written word, the laws, the codes that inform how we operate, whether informally or formally. And so it's a specific kind of advocacy. And I think both are really critical for the sector. We are, as many people know, facing a turning point in our nation. We are experiencing a number of different crises. Just to give you a few examples to just demonstrate what the lay of the land looks like. Jacob Blake is currently paralyzed from the waist down, laying in a hospital bed. And this is 3 months after protests for the murder of George Floyd. We still do not have justice for Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. We have hurricanes that are raging much more virulently than they have previously. We have wildfires raging in California. And so when we think about what's going on right now, there is a lot that has put our country in a state of turmoil. We've seen firsthand how COVID has laid bare all the disparities in the health system. So when we think about nonprofits in particular, nonprofits are uniquely situated to be able to proffer solutions to some of these challenges that have been systemic, challenges that have existed for a long time. I would say, and this is something that I've learned from Brian Stevenson. He's an NYU law professor. He founded the Equal Justice Initiative, which focuses on providing services and litigation for those that have been involved in the criminal system, particularly in fighting against the death penalty. But he talks about this idea of getting in proximity to suffering, getting in proximity to some of the challenges that we face. And nonprofits are in proximity. Nonprofits work with those that have traditionally been marginalized. Nonprofits have the ability to empower. Nonprofits are rooted in the communities that we are talking about. Nonprofits are knowledgeable about the challenges, and not just the challenges we face, but why we're facing them and how we got here. So it's important for nonprofits to make a shift and recognize the power that they hold given that proximity. Proximity to that suffering also means proximity to some of the answers that are needed. And without the voice of nonprofits, those answers can't be put forth. So it's imperative, I think, that nonprofits start seeing themselves as advocates and engaging in advocacy and engaging in policy. I think sometimes there's this notion of thinking that advocacy is politics and protest. And while that can be a component of it, that's not the entirety of advocacy. When you think about the work to shift narrative, right? Like we're talking about not just what a challenge is, but how we got to that challenge, and language is very powerful. Being explicit about some of the root causes is very powerful. That's a form of advocacy. When nonprofits join forces and collaborate with other nonprofits and think about the collective power that they bring through doing that, that's a form of advocacy. When nonprofits serve as conveners for the communities in which they're rooted, that's a kind of advocacy as well. So I want nonprofits to shift from a limited type of thinking about what advocacy and policy is, and really engage in that work and really see it as part of their mission and values.
I love that. What a great first answer. Oh my gosh, such good framing of what's going on in the world, right? And how what we're seeing is connected to policy, it's connected to structures, right? It's laid bare everything that's been going on. So my next question is, that you and I also talked about, is why don't more organizations engage in policy and advocacy work? What do you think?
Yeah, so there's some very specific challenges, and I'll even go as far as to call them myths. So I'll just tackle a few of them here. So one thing that nonprofits often talk about is they don't have the capacity or resources to engage in advocacy. They may be thinking about some of the large national nonprofits that have staff who serve as directors of advocacy or directors of policy. But I would push back and say you don't need those kinds of resources to be able to engage in advocacy and policy. And if you go back to the definition that I gave in the first question, nonprofits can start this work today, whether or not they have people filling those roles, right? There's not a cost to a nonprofit to show up for a hearing, right? That it's city council is putting on to discuss some issue. You can show up, you can read a statement, you can invite members of the community to join with you. You can work with other nonprofits that are working to address the same issue. That's just one example. I talked a lot about narrative. That has to do with tweaking language used on nonprofit websites, used in how nonprofits speak to funders, how nonprofits speak to various constituents about the challenges that they're working on. So if I think of an example, if I think of a food bank, for example, they're responding to an immediate need. They're addressing hunger. So a way that they might think about advocacy and policy is to show up to a hearing, where there's some local ordinance being considered about expanding shelter services, or maybe laws that are restrictive and require removal of people who are facing homelessness from certain vicinities. That doesn't require a cost. The way that they might think about changing their language has to do with not just describing their work as providing food and services for people who are facing hunger and food insecurity. They might talk about, well, why? What are some of the subgroups and populations that are more likely to experience this, and how did we get there? What ecosystem are we operating in that brings people there? So that's just one example. It doesn't require that you have specific staff. It doesn't require certain resources for nonprofits to start engaging in advocacy and policy today. Another thing that I hear with nonprofits is we're not an advocacy organization. So I actually have worked at a legal nonprofit providing legal services that does consider itself an advocacy organization. But the beauty of that work was that we worked with so many other nonprofits that didn't necessarily consider themselves advocacy organizations, but were fighting for their lives. When you think about the disparities that, some of their constituents face. So they joined forces with us, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this later in our conversation, but they joined forces with us to address issues in healthcare access, for example. And these were organizations that did not consider themselves advocacy organizations. So when you take an expansive view of what advocacy is and why it's needed, I would say every nonprofit has the ability to be an advocacy organization and should think of itself in that way. When you are thinking about the range of issues that nonprofits touch upon, work on, facilitate, it's just important for nonprofits to expand how they define themselves within that environment. I think another challenge that I hear is, we're nonpartisan, we're not into politics. But the thing is, nonprofits have to engage and be part of our democracy. Um, we are not going to see the kinds of changes that nonprofits call for, the kinds of changes that our communities are calling for, if we are okay with just maintaining the status quo and operating in the status quo and being, a small piece in the status quo. Nothing will change. So we have to think about ways to move us beyond that. And I'd say a requirement for doing so is engaging in advocacy and policy. Whether, and nonprofits may use one tool or another at a different time, depending on what is happening. It's not that a nonprofit has to use every single tool all at once. But thinking about what is going to be most responsive to the particular issue at hand is really important. I think another one, and this is a big one, I think there's just a lot of fear. There's nonprofits that are not familiar with what they can do, and so maybe fear that they can't engage in advocacy because they risk their tax exempt status. Some may be fearful of what funders will think or do, but I think nonprofits have to start learning more about what some of the thresholds are within specific kinds of advocacy. And I think they have to kind of decide who they want to be in this space. You can't move past the fear if you don't make a decision about what you're going to do and who you're going to be. So I think that's another important factor. And, what I'd say about funders is we're actually now in a time where funders themselves are reconsidering how they provide support to their grantees. They're thinking about their role in the current environment. They're thinking about shifts that they want to make. So now is a great opportunity to think about the language you're going to use and how you're going to re-engage funders around the issues that you're addressing. I also want to say, I think there's a difference between recognizing that nonprofits have certain restricted funding and not using that restricted funding to do certain kinds of advocacy, but again, thinking about that expansive definition that I gave at the beginning, and then also thinking about, again, how to talk to funders going forward about the work that is required to make the change and the shifts that we want to see in the nonprofit sector. So I think those are all the the main things that I hear and have heard from nonprofits. But I would say we have to really move beyond that if we want to have the impact we do as a sector.
That's great. When you and I spoke, we talked about how how to say it is like there really isn't a total dedication to justice if you're within the sector, if you're not engaged in policy work. Mm-hmm. There's a source, and I'll try to share it with you. Phil Duvall does some work around poverty alleviation and disrupting generational poverty. And I presented once about how the middle class was created to a group of students at a very high wealth private California university. And the students had no idea how the middle class came to be. They had no idea the policies that were enacted with the GI Bill and redlining around housing, all of the things. They had never heard these things at age 20, 21, 22. And it was really helpful for them to hear that and to understand the long-lasting generational impact of policy decisions. Many are not accidental, right? Many are highly intentional,
exactly right.
Systematic exclusion and mistreatment of folks. So I'm gonna shift around to asking you the question that you and I talked about, like how you and I chatted, like this is about justice. Getting involved, especially right now, is about going all the way with who you are and serving your community. Mm-hmm. If you're gonna feed folks and provide direct service and do the work that you do, there's all that other work that's embedded in that of why you have to do your work. You have to do your work, often connected to policy. So I want to hear what you think about that, Jennifer. Like, what's the connection?
Absolutely. I mean, we, like you said it, we're not here by accident, and policy is happening with or without nonprofits. So it is critical that nonprofits show up, nonprofits see the power that they have, especially, as a collective force, and use that power for good. Otherwise, why does the sector exist? Why is the sector here? So and I think when we're talking about the challenges that nonprofits have risen to address, these things are not by accident. These things have been deliberate choices along the way. And they're choices that have been made and policies that have been enacted. And now they've been in operation for so long, we don't even see how we got here. We don't even see the road, that we were on to get here. So I think nonprofits just have to really understand that, whether that means they're going back and rethinking their vision and their values so that they are equipped and, explicitly taking on these challenges in that way. I think nonprofits have to make that decision. When I think about justice, I think justice it's a state of being, it's an ecosystem, and the policy and advocacy are the tools to get there. So if nonprofits don't engage with those tools, we will not get to a system of justice, right? We have to move beyond short-term solutions. We have to move beyond quick fixes and get to, what we really intend to see. And that is justice. One of the resources that I shared, and you'll send this out to the participants on this webinar later, it's a resource from Vule, who is a nonprofit professional, and he has a blog, and he really goes to task on just nonprofits and funders. And he gives this analogy of how there's fires going on, and notwithstanding what's happening in California, but there's fires. There's people who set fires and it's intentional, and then there's people who put out fires. And the people who put out fires, think about, well, what kind of mask do we need to be able to operate in the system? What kind of materials do we need to build buildings that can withstand fires? Rather than thinking about the question of how do we stop the root cause of people who set fires from doing that. And that's what nonprofits have to engage in. It's one thing to tend to an immediate need. And I'm going to go back to that example of, a food bank. There's a need for people to be fed today, especially when I think about this COVID environment where people have lost jobs and, facing significant resource and income challenges, right? So there is that need. But we have to think about, again, how did we get here? While no one could have predicted a pandemic, we also had policies along the way that, have prevented people from being able to save up for a rainy day. People that are struggling to make ends meet who, couldn't meet the need of this moment. And so now we're in this position where, we're seeing some of those disparities across our country, like I mentioned before. So I think that, it's just really important to understand that road and the role that nonprofits can take in shaping how we go forward, and not just providing those quick solutions, but thinking about the history, thinking about how we got here. And with that, thinking about what's needed to, dismantle and undo some of those mechanisms for how we got here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to make this, it sounds really not hard, but kind of lofty, like you should jump in. So I want you to share some examples of what this looked like in your work in organizations. And specifically, one of the things you had told me was that you had to register as a lobbyist when you were at New York. And I thought, what? Like, how does that all happen? So I would love for you to tell about your journey so people can understand specifically what this looks like within an organization.
Yeah, so one of the organizations I worked with was New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And so, I recognize that I say this as an attorney, but you don't need to be an attorney to engage in advocacy and policy. But I was a health justice staff attorney, and we focused on disparities in communities of color and low income communities. And so one of the campaigns that I worked on had to do with the immigrant community. And the specific challenge was that when it came to accessing healthcare services, especially for those who are limited English proficient or English language learners, one of the challenges was in accessing prescription medications. And so people would access those medications, and the instructions would not be translated. So you had a situation where people are taking the wrong doses of medication, not understanding how to take their medication, et cetera. And you can think about the costs of ending up in the emergency room for not taking your medication, as instructed. So that campaign had to do with passing state legislation in New York requiring pharmacies to translate prescription medication in the top 6 languages in the state. So part of that work was, working with elected officials, sharing information with them about how it impacted their constituents, especially when you think about how diverse New York is, how many different communities there are in the state. So another part of it was thinking about how to educate, people who owned and operated pharmacies, particularly those smaller mom and pop type pharmacies. That was where we faced significant challenges because they were focused on the cost to do so. So it was educating them on how the cost actually was limited. Part of it was, working very closely with communities that were impacted by this so that they could share their stories with elected officials, doing lobby days in Albany, the state capital. So that was the work on that campaign. And actually it was a successful campaign. We were able to pass that state legislation, and it was modeled after legislation passed in New York City. So because that work specifically had to do with trying to pass legislation or have an impact on legislation, my organization had to register, its staff that worked on those kinds of campaigns as lobbyists in the state. So anytime that an organization or staff are doing something to influence legislation, and there's specific definitions of what that means. If you go to the IRS website, then you have to register and disclose some of that. So there's doing that at the federal level if it has to do with federal legislation, and then there's doing that at the state level if it's state or local legislation. So I didn't work on any federal legislation, but in the state, there's a body called the Joint Commission on Public Ethics, and they have a threshold where if your organization spends more than $5,000 or more on lobbying activities, then you have to register and disclose it each year. So what might those costs look like? If you think about a nonprofit, it's probably really easy to get to that cost, and that's not a huge amount of nonprofit budgets when you think about it. So that might be the staff salaries of the staff who are working on addressing that legislation. It might be, the documents that we're printing, these one-pagers and information leaflets that we're sharing with elected officials, et cetera, et cetera. So at that time, I was registered as a lobbyist. My organization registered on my behalf. I didn't have to do anything specific. And then actually, when I worked at Brooklyn Community Services, which is a large multi-service agency, we didn't do any work related to lobbying per se, but we still had to fill out certain information because we had outreach to elected officials. When we're thinking about the city budget that's being passed and we're looking for resources for an organization that's over 90% government funded, those were activities that had to be disclosed as well. So it's not anything that's scary. Like when you think about, oh my goodness, I have to register as a lobbyist, what does that mean? It's simple, and it's just a mechanism for you disclosing information on the activities that you're engaging in. The good thing about that is it means nonprofits can engage in advocacy, and specifically nonprofits can engage in lobbying. I think that that's actually another myth. Some nonprofits think that they can't do any lobbying or they stay away from it because they don't understand what those thresholds and rules are. And there's different rules at the federal level, but it just takes some, education on some of those thresholds, and being informed about what policy is taking place. When you think about policy, a lot of it happens at the state and local level, and that is really critical. So for nonprofits that need to engage, this would be another opportunity to do that. I mentioned earlier in our discussion how a nonprofit, it doesn't take much for a nonprofit to show up at a local city council hearing and talk about how some issue has impacted their constituents. Again, it doesn't take much for nonprofits to kind of organize themselves and be able to engage in lobbying, which has to do with specifically passing laws or ordinances, things of that nature.
Such good points. It's been amazing to me. I've attended quite a few city council meetings. The stuff that gets passed, like I'm there for a certain reason. Like I'm there for some agenda item, but you have to sit and wait for your turn, right? You got to fill out your little card, and it does feel very intimidating, but it's also very thrilling and exciting to be there. But I've always been amazed at all the other stuff that's being voted on. The same time when I'm
Yes.
doing the issue and thinking, oh my gosh, I know about 20 people that would really care about this, and they are not here. They do not know.
Yes. And that is such an important point. And when you think about elected officials, 9 times out of 10, I'd say they are not experts on some of these matters. They may be experts on one matter, but if you think about all the things that they're passing, whether at the state, local, federal level, they are not experts. And so they are relying on the people that are in their ears, that are in their faces, that are sharing information. So what does this landscape look like if nonprofits are not taking a part of that process? Again, this is what it means to be engaged in our democracy. This has nothing to do with your politics, your personal politics. You can be a nonpartisan organization and still show up and talk about how, things matter for the people that you work with, the people, that are coming to your organization. I can't stress enough how important it is for nonprofits to show up. Nonprofits actually have some of that expertise that is needed to, really inform our elected officials on matters that they're voting on. When you think about not just the expertise, but the people who understand the nuance of how something will work, not just as written in a law, but the implementation, right? Being able to talk about the challenges in implementation, if it unfolds a certain way or not, is really critical. So nonprofits, again, they're uniquely situated to be able to speak to these issues because this is their day-to-day work. This is what they do. So you have to be able to come to the table and I'll say that again, come to the table and be a part of this democratic process.
Absolutely. And I've worked a lot with local government where 50% or more of the time they have an ordinance or something they want to pass and they have an idea. And I teach innovation to these organizations and test how to test these issues, test these solutions. And more than half the time, it does not align with what community wants. When we go door to door and we talk to community members, they're like, I don't really know about that, but what I care about is this. Right? They're super passionate about what's causing them pain and what they're frustrated by. And elected officials and their staff are doing the best. I have to assume that they have the best of intent, but they're missing it a lot of the time. And that brings up another piece that Jennifer and I had talked about in our previous chats was about even when organizations do engage, they often will just bring, their CEO, a board member, and a staff person. But what we talked about was, what about the role of community? How do we engage community? And not in the way where it's like what people would call poverty pimping, getting one person that has a horrible tale to share. But like, what would it look like to have community fully engaged? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that I think that is really important. When I'm speaking of nonprofits, I am specifically thinking about those that are very much rooted in their communities. So they are, again, in proximity to these issues. They are regularly engaging their constituents. They are learning from their constituents. They are being informed by their constituents, and their constituents are very much at the table and a part of the work, compared to nonprofits that are removed, don't fully understand the issues or understand them in a very surface way, and are coming as kind of spokespeople for populations that they're not really engaged with. I think there's a difference between the two, and I think the latter can actually do a great disservice, if they're not rooted in the communities that they served. I think that, if I think about my experience, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, for example, we're a lot of lawyers, and we used a model called community lawyering. So we weren't the lawyers that go in and talk about the issues or tell people what they're going to do. Not at all. Especially because when you think about a lawyer, that can be intimidating for some people. No, we were informed by members of our community. We partnered with a lot of other organizations, that had a number of different kinds of members, address a number of different kinds of issues. And I think that was key to what made the work effective. So yes, the lawyers can come and we can, file some litigation to address this issue. We can, use our tools to think about what advocacy on this issue looks like. We can think about what's needed, what are some of the resources and capacities needed to organize and, have an advocacy day or a lobbying day. But we're not doing that in a vacuum, right? Like, we're not showing up and speaking to these issues without the community. So that's vital. And even my time at Brooklyn Community Services, for example, we worked all across Brooklyn on a number of different issues, whether it's, providing after school services, youth development, supports for adults with developmental disabilities, mental health challenges, etc. We're not doing that work in a vacuum. We're not showing up to city council requesting funds without being knowledgeable and informed by the community on what kinds of programming are needed to even be able to request the funds. So, I think that any work that a nonprofit is doing has to be informed by the people that it's working with. And those people have to be seen as equal partners. I think without that, you run into some problems, and you're not in proximity to either to the challenges or to the solutions that are very much needed. And we see the evidence of that, right? Like, the reason we have this status quo is because we have operated in that way. So we've not been able to put forth some of those solutions on a broader scale. I think we're starting to get there, and I think the protests that we've seen, I think, some of the calls for what's needed in during the COVID pandemic, I think we're starting to make some of those shifts, but we haven't been there. So it's important to reflect on what our role has been, what the role of nonprofits has been, and again, think about, who do nonprofits want to be in this space? How do they want to show up? They want to show up engaging in advocacy, engaging in policy, engaging in the democratic process, and they want to show up as having been partners, equal partners with members of the community.
Absolutely. And one of the questions Melanie talks about in the chat, and you've talked a little bit about fear, but I want to go a little bit deeper because I think it does hold so many organizations back. Melanie's talking about you fear that you'll lose your exempt status if they engage in advocacy. That's been her experience. My experience also with nonprofits trying to engage in social enterprise activities. They're so worried about earned income and like what that will do to their status. And there's just seems like such a murky area where organizations don't know the thresholds. And I wonder, like, what would it take for someone to actually lose their exempt status? I don't know a lot of examples where that's even happened. If it was rampant, I can imagine people saying, oh, I have 30 examples in my community where organizations have been ripped away their status, but I never hear that. And so I'm curious, like, have you heard of this, or what really is that fear about?
I actually can't think of any examples of an organization losing their status. I think some of it is, when you think about the IRS, that just initially can be off-putting. So I think there's maybe a reluctance to kind of even toe that line. So I think what's needed is for nonprofits to, and some of the resources that you'll send around include a couple of, advocacy and lobbying toolkits for nonprofits to better understand what's at stake, what some of the thresholds are, what you can and can't do. I think part of it is just education and being informed and taking the time out as part of your work to be informed on these issues. So visiting the IRS website, understanding what's required in your state, looking through these toolkits, because the thresholds actually, at least at the federal level, they have to do with the organizational budget. So it's not even, there's not like a hard and fast rule, but it has to do with the organization size and budget. And again, there's specific definitions about what kind of activity. But I think, again, this is a time for nonprofits to put fear aside, and to be brave and courageous and engage and, have, I don't know, bring someone in to do a training, find pro bono attorneys that can come in and talk about what nonprofits can or can't do. A lot of nonprofit boards have attorneys on them, see if there's someone in that person's network who can help think about this issue or do some research on this issue, so a nonprofit knows exactly where it stands relative to its budget and its activities, and can engage in some of these. And like I said, when you think about advocacy, the policy and lobbying is a very specific piece. It's not even the whole of the work. So if you think about it that way, and it's just one component, it's not as scary to think about how you might engage, right? I don't think we're talking about nonprofits shifting to where they're, passing 30 bills in a year and doing, that level of lobbying. We're thinking about what are some of the ways a nonprofit can be strategic and think about some of the most crucial policies that have to do with its work and showing up for that. And when you think about it that way, when you take a step back and you think about the smaller components of this work, it's not as scary as it sounds. And again, to your point, I can't think of specific examples of nonprofits that have lost their status, or to the extent that they've lost their status, I think they've been engaging in pretty egregious behavior, financial mismanagement, things of that nature as a collective, not nonprofits that are engaging in our democracy and speaking to the issues that matter to its community members.
Oh, you make me, I put the resources in the chat so you can look at those now, but they'll also be in an email to everyone that's registered. And, Melanie's question that makes me think about conversations that she and I have had about, just as where we are now is not an accident, the lack of engagement in policy and advocacy work of nonprofits is also not accidental. Right? There isn't a lot of training. Like when you go to set up your very first 501c3, there isn't a lot in there that says, and part of this and your commitment to justice and community work is getting involved in policy. And here's what that looks like. And here's what it means. It's such an afterthought. So many organizations want to jump to direct service, which makes sense. I get it. That's usually what spawns the passion for starting the nonprofit in the first place. But it's so fascinating to me how that is such a missing piece of the puzzle. And political empowerment is so huge. It's so important no matter where you fall on that spectrum. But I would suggest that most nonprofit folks that I know tend to lean a certain way. But I think that's a larger question that we need to ask as a sector. Is like, why isn't this front and center? Why has this been so feared and made this very confusing matrix, and we don't even know how to navigate? I think it's not by accident. So I have another question and more that I want to talk to Jennifer about, but I would love to hear what questions you have. Specifically, if you want to ask, like, for your organization, if you have an example you want to give and you want Jennifer's feedback, if there's something you're thinking about from this conversation that you want to bring up and discuss, please put that in the chat, and we would love to call upon you and give you that time. While you're thinking about that, Jennifer, I wanted to ask about, like, what do you see as shifting? And are you seeing things that are hopeful? If we know that organizations in the sector need to engage in policy work, what are you seeing? Like, what's giving you hope for the future right now that kind of lays the stage?
Yeah, so I think things are for sure shifting, right? We're having a lot more national discourse, discussion around the issues that have existed for a long time, but that have, reached a turning point, an inflection point, and presented an opportunity for us to think about, do we commit ourselves to the ideals we say we hold? And the answer is no, because we don't have the evidence of that yet. So I think that that's an important shift, these conversations that have happened. I think there are some policy changes that have happened. So for example, when we think about the murder of George Floyd, there are cities that have already, banned chokeholds, for example, and taken other action. There's conversations around, how do we, some people call it defund the police. Some people call it shift resources to other entities that should actually be the ones to show up, rather than police. So these shifts are happening. What I would say is that we need to be vigilant about not only these shifts, but how things will change as these shifts happen, right? Because there's always a response whenever there's great momentum and change in our society. I want to give like a quick history lesson and example. Like if I think about Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered earlier this year, part of the the articulation from those perpetrators was he looked suspicious. He looked like he didn't belong. If I think about post-Reconstruction in our country, we had Black codes. Black codes were a system of laws that were meant to keep Black people in this country subjugated and under the thumb of people who had been former slave owners, etc. Those laws had language in them about who had permission to be where, who could be in a certain space after dark, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think about that and how long ago that was, and I think about today, how we have, people who are still viewed as you don't belong here or suspicious, or we have to do something about your presence here. There are those roots and those, systems. And so while we don't have Black codes today, things have morphed to keep up with the shifts that we have seen in society. So we have, civil rights laws, we have protections written in the law, but we also operate in a society that still has found other ways to, create or to other people that they deem as not being worthy or not belonging. So when you think about it like that, and you think about that kind of concrete example, this means that we have to be vigilant about how these shifts will create other reactions that morph along with these shifts. So I think that is going to be our work as we see new laws passed for the better and that shift the status quo. We definitely have to be ready for how there will be other reactions meant to maintain the status quo.
It's a great response. You give me a little bit of hope. I'm still worried about the world. Oh my! But you do give me hope. You make me feel good that those shifts. We can do better. We can be better. One question that someone had posted before the chat. Actually, I'm going to defer that one. So Tina has a question. How successful have you been? Have you seen an organization be achieving a policy change on their own? our organization has struggled with investing in advocacy, coalition building, and the differing priorities that can emerge in leading policy work on their own. What would you say for Tina's question?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I think one of the things I would say there is the good thing is nonprofits don't have to do this alone. Nonprofits don't have to be the only entity or the only one, fighting these battles. I think that, and that has to do with the kind of advocacy that I talked about before. Part of that advocacy is our collective power to collaborate, to partner, to come together. And I think that makes for a much stronger case on, whatever particular issue we're trying to do advocacy on. When you have a group, when you have a collective, when you have a stronger voice. So I would say that work looks like seeking out and inviting other nonprofits to join so that, this particular nonprofit isn't the only one having to fight a particular battle. Again, when I think about my work at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and Brooklyn Community Services, part of what made the work successful was partnering with other organizations. We couldn't have done that work as a single entity, wouldn't have done that work as a single entity. And then it also allows you to pull resources together. So, if this organization is going to send out the call and the invite, this organization is going to bring the snacks, this organization is going to provide the tech, needed to do a presentation, whatever it is. So thinking about how to pool resources, how to come together, how to collaborate is critical for this work. So I would say it has to start there with thinking about, if you haven't already thought about partners, thinking about what other partners. It may be nonprofits that have already been vocal on an issue. It may be nonprofits that haven't been vocal, but they're actually working on the same issue. So maybe we just set up an initial call with them, see, learn more about their work, share more about what we're thinking, see if there's some opportunities to come together and band forces. So I think that's a huge part of it.
That's great. Melanie has a follow-up question. I know, Melanie, your video is not working. Do you want to frame your question quickly to Jennifer?
Sure. Hi, Jennifer. Heather and I have talked about this precise topic before as well, and I think one of the questions, it's more of a rhetorical question maybe, but one of the questions I have is, how do we help nonprofits get to that type of collaboration when there does seem to be so much either in overt or covert competition for funding and for being like the organization that can, say this is what we did. And so I think that that's a real challenge in the way funding is structured. And I don't want to take us off topic from power and advocacy, but policy and advocacy. But I do really wonder about that. My field principally has been environmental conservation. Excuse me. And I see that all the time. I'm so sorry about my voice. I see that all the time in communities where there are dozens of conservation organizations, and it would really behoove them to be collaborative and work together, and they would have so much of a greater impact on a policy issue if they came as one united group in solidarity to make that push. But that they often splinter because of either very minor differences of opinion or because of this notion that they individually kind of waters down their own engagement as just one of many, and then they can't point to it as a success when they're going to seek funding or ask donors to support their work. So I know that's a really huge question, but I completely concur with you about collaboration, but I think there's some very real world challenges to that. And I'm wondering what your experience and thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely understand and have seen that. And actually, going back to Voulet, whose blog post, he actually talks about this in some of his postings about the nonprofit Hunger Games, as he calls it. So I think the first step is acknowledging this, right? Maybe we can't bring every single nonprofit along, but I think it has to do with thinking about how are you going to be the change that you want to see. So maybe it starts with you as a nonprofit having some of those initial conversations, some of those initial meet and greets to meet other nonprofit staff, other nonprofit executives, informally, formally. It's about building relationship with one another. And once you start building a relationship with one another, you can build trust. And you can think about how you even come together to do joint proposals. So that was one of the things that we did at Brooklyn Community Services, is we would partner with other entities. Sometimes they did similar work, sometimes they did work that was a little bit different, but together it made sense for a project, and we would submit joint proposals. I also think it has to do with having these conversations with funders. We've got such a power imbalance when we think about funders and grantees, and that has to shift. And now is the time for it to shift, because like I mentioned, funders are starting to have these, moments of great reckoning as well. But have these conversations with funders and talk to them and, articulate how, that it actually would make sense to join together with these two other nonprofits who are addressing the same issue. Sometimes funders, they're not just providing funding, but they're thinking about the capacity building as well, and thinking about how they're going to convene their grantees. So I would say, to the extent that you can, seek them out and have those conversations. And again, this has to do with moving away from a fear-based approach to an approach of, where you recognize your power. You, as a nonprofit, you have expertise, you have power. And so you have to walk in that, and you have to show up in that. And does it mean that everyone will join you? No. And that's okay. But the people who are meant to, the other organizations that are meant to, will. And, maybe they've been walking in fear as well, but once you shine that light for them and they see, oh, maybe we don't have to do it this way, or, oh, I like what they're doing, maybe we can learn something. Those are opportunities to shift away from that fear and from that competition. It may take some time to change. I don't want to just gloss over that concern. I think it's a very valid and real concern. But I think what's incumbent upon you is you do what you can in the space that you're in right now. And over time, you start to see some of these shifts. If you don't already, I would encourage reading Wu Lei's blog. He really, talks about a lot of these issues, and also has some additional resources and additional, conversations that are being had with others in the sector. And I think that can provide some useful information as well.
Absolutely. We always say that organizations want to own the change. Like, I did it, it's me. It's like, how can you think you did that? Or that you own feeding a community, or that you own this resource. It doesn't make any sense when communities don't think that way. One question that someone had beforehand was, how do you get the board on board? If your board's not typically engaged in policy and advocacy work, you haven't done that as an executive leadership team or staff, it hasn't been a focus area, sometimes they can be hard to convince and move along. So I'm curious if you have any tactics or recommendations for getting the board engaged in this.
Yeah. So very, very good question. I have worked with a board of directors, been a liaison on different board committees as part of my work as an employee at a nonprofit. I've also served on boards. And I think, again, it just has to do with, how do you engage the board on really understanding the issues? So I think you have to, approach board members with, where there's convergence interests, where, they've joined this board for a reason. They've joined this board because they're passionate about the issue. So how do you have conversations with them? Again, it has to do with that relationship building. So you're not going to go in and beat them over the head with, we need to do advocacy right now. We need to do advocacy right now. You're going to have a conversation about, what's going on in this particular issue that we're addressing, and what is the impact on the community and the people that you're working with. And given that impact, what are some next steps that we can take to address this issue that, takes us to the next level above and beyond what we've been doing thus far. And that looks like engaging in this kind of activity and being very specific and concrete about what that activity is. If it's we've learned that, this ordinance is going to be passed, and here's why it matters that we engage this, because if we don't, here's what's happening in our community. And actually, we know that other nonprofits are going to be showing up to talk about this issue. Or, it's having a conversation with board members, where if it's not an ordinance, it's, actually we're going to collaborate with these other nonprofits because we understand there's a larger ecosystem that's at play here. Again, you understand how to be diplomatic with your nonprofit work. You understand how to speak to different audiences. And so you're really calling on those skills when you're having these conversations with board members, with funders. And you're also looking for allies, right? So maybe you're not going to the board member that hasn't shown up as much. Maybe you're going first to the one who's been very engaged, right? And then because they're your ally, they're able to have some of those conversations with other board members, and they're able to help build some of that consensus. So you're not doing it all on your own. So it's really thinking about the different ways that you maneuver in relationships to bring forth some of the things that you're seeking to do.
I love that. I love that. I want to thank you so much. This has been amazing to learn with you and for you to share with everyone here today. I put a link to your LinkedIn, and then I put your email address. And how else can people find you and engage with you?
Yeah, I think the main ways are LinkedIn and email. I'm happy to answer any questions and continue this conversation. I, sometimes post different things that I find interesting, different resources on LinkedIn. So that would be another great way to engage. And I actually, I know we're at time, I wanted to make one more point about advocacy very briefly. We've talked a lot about external advocacy. Advocacy also starts at home. When you think about who is in the nonprofit space, women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So thinking about the policies that you implement in your nonprofit, with your staff and employees, that's another important element of advocacy. So I just wanted to make that final plug, but like I said, I'm very excited and passionate about this conversation. We definitely need to keep this conversation going. So reach out to me over email or LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you. What you will get next is an email with some key resources that have been shared in the chat, but we'll share them again, and a couple other ones that people have asked about or have been referenced. So I'll make sure those are in there as well. I think that we're going to be working on an article together, so stay tuned for that, talking about these issues, keeping them top of mind. And it does seem like a new place to venture into, but please reach out to Jennifer if you need any support or have questions about how to move forward through your policy and advocacy journey, even if you're just starting. And we thank you for joining us, and thank you, Jennifer. You've just been awesome. And thank you all, and we'll send out the recording very soon. Have a